Hi everyone, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be going over homeostasis. This lecture was originally this lecture originally had three parts to it: temperature regulation, thirst, and feeding. But the feeding section ended up being kind of long, so it got its own lecture. So today it's going to be a little bit of a shorter lecture because we're just going to be going over temperature regulation and thirst. And I think the first thing to think about is, what does temperature regulation have to do with psychology? So this is kind of an interesting correlation between something that seems pretty biologically mediated, which is, temperature regulation, and obviously psychology, which is the study of behavior in the mind. But as we said in the first lecture, and as I just mentioned, psychology is the study of behavior, and many homeostatic feedback loops are going to modulate the biological set points that we care about through behavioral change. So temperature regulation is one of those things. A lot of what's happening with temperature regulation is through behavioral modification. For instance, so this is a picture of a vulture, and vultures are kind of disgusting. They live in very hot areas, and one way they cool themselves down is by pooping on themselves. So they poop on their legs and their feathers down here, and the evaporation of the feces cools them down. So this is something that they do behaviorally to modify their temperature. And there's a picture of a bunch of snakes. I don't know if these are garter snakes, but these are snakes nonetheless. But garter snakes in particular, when they're born, and if they are male, they will secrete female hormones to attract older males that will then kind of writhe on top of them to increase their body temperature. So reptiles, as we're going to get into momentarily, are cold-blooded creatures, so they don't have the ability to increase their body temperature. So this is one behavioral way that they do that. We have this picture of this flamingo, and many birds that are similar to flamingos will do something like this, where they will pick their leg up and kind of bring it into their body, and this is a way to maintain heat. So they have less of their body exposed to the elements. So homeostasis is a biological process that keeps body variables in a fixed range. So this is a pretty good example of a homeostatic feedback loop, where we have in two examples two individuals that are either cold or hot. The stimulus, which is the temperature, then sets off a sensor in our brain, or sensory receptors that then communicate to our brain. Control centers in the brain then communicate with some effector site, causing some behavioral change or physiological adaptation to deal with the deviation from a biological norm. So it gets too hot, we have the heat stimulus, causing sensory nerves to be activated that then communicate with the hypothalamus, realistically, and then send information to the tissue to sweat. Or in this case, it sends information to the musculature to start to shiver, to produce heat. So homeostasis is the process and a reaction to the body's deviation from a set point, which I'm going to define. So obviously, you'll need to know what homeostasis is, and we'll probably have some examples where you have to pick out homeostasis. And as I alluded to, we have things that are called biological set points. A set point is a value that the body works to maintain. And biological organisms have physiological need states to survive, which is where the set points come from. So a set point isn't what the body needs to survive, but it is something that's coming from the body's need to survive. So, for instance, with this example with calcium, you need 0.16 grams per liter of calcium in your blood. And if you don't have that, then certain basic physiological functions are not going to work. If you fall below that, you will siphon it from your bones. And if you exceed that, you will store the excess in your bones, or you'll excrete the calcium. So again, your body has several physiological responses to either too much calcium, which is storing it in the bone, or getting rid of it, through your pee, Or if you are deficient in calcium, then your body will literally start to look for calcium in its storage, and it will take it from your bones. So a set point is not a need state. We have certain need states because if we are going past a certain temperature, if we're deficient in a certain ion, then literally the function of that system will fail. So need states are where our set points are coming from. So homeostasis is the biological process that keeps body variables in a fixed range. And it's really important to note that homeostasis is the process that is used to maintain a set point, not the need to stay within that set point. So the fact that if you go over a certain temperature and your cells die, or the fact that if you are deficient in calcium, or if you have too much potassium or not enough sodium, all these things that are necessary for basic physiological function, that's not homeostasis. The fact that you will become attracted to eating salt if you're deficient in sodium is an example of a homeostatic process. So homeostasis is a biological process that keeps body variables in a fixed range, and it is not a set point, and it is not the need to stay within a set point. So just make sure that you understand that homeostasis is a process or a mechanism. Homeostasis in itself is not the actual need. Okay, so we're going to talk about something called allostasis, but first, before we define allostasis, we're going to talk about negative feedback. So many of the behaviors that we engage in to combat a deviation from a set point is driven by negative feedback. And we're going to define negative feedback as negative reinforcement in our learning section. But for right now, we're just going to say that negative feedback refers to an uncomfortable stimulus that drives a behavior that will remedy that feeling before you are in danger. So again, this is actually kind of textbook definitionally negative reinforcement. But we're not going to define that yet because we will go into that in much greater detail in our learning lecture. But essentially, before you get to a point that is going to kill you, before you're actually dangerously deficient in ions, or before you have dangerously overheated, you have certain cues that will set off, like being, like the fact that it hurts to be too hot. The fact that if you're in a sauna for too long, you start to feel a strong motivational drive to get out of the sauna, which is, again, I know that it may be annoying to some people because it's like maybe some people don't care, but this is why the question of free will came up on the second extra credit assignment, and why we started the class off talking about dualism and monism, and why I think that we have a real duty in our society to think about this, because our society really plays, cares a lot about our ability to make decisions and holding people morally accountable for those decisions that they make. I don't know that I hold people morally accountable for a lot of the decisions they make, but people have to be held accountable in some way. You can't have dangerous people walking around. But, the sauna example is a really good kind of illustration of the point that we have very little control over our behavior once our biology decides to take over. Thirst is another really good example of that, which is why we're going to talk about it momentarily. But you can't, there's some people out there that probably have the ability to stay in a sauna until they die, but realistically, most people are going to feel so uncomfortable and have such little executive control over their actions once they get to that desperate point that they will exit the sauna before they have any real harm. So, it just kind of is a interesting example to think about how much control you actually have, because once these kinds of situations happen and you start getting, once these type of situations start happening and your sympathetic nervous system starts to take hold of you and your prefrontal cortex becomes underactive and other brain areas that drive motivation and behavior start to become overactive, then the question of how can you really, how much control do you really have over that behavioral output starts to become pretty interesting. I think I got a little bit meme happy in this lecture for some reason. I think because a lot of this is just text, so I wanted something to distract us. But in any case, let's define allostasis. So allostasis is not homeostasis. It is slightly different. Allostasis is anticipatory behavior to maintain a biological set point. Homeostasis is a reaction to a deviation in a set point, while allostasis is anticipatory to inhibit a deviation from that set point. So there's a very strong and important difference between allostasis and homeostasis, and this was originally thought of because people needed a way to explain how organisms have a biological drive to consume, certain minerals, or certain types of macronutrients, or even needing to cool down before they were actually in any kind of physiological trouble. So that's where the theory of allostasis came about. And then I just have this little note here that we're not perfect at maintaining biological set points. That's why we have issues like obesity, high blood pressure, and dehydration. So allostasis is not a perfect mechanism, but you will become thirsty well before you need fluid in most circumstances. If you have some kind of, as we'll talk about, some kind of hypovolemic insult or threat, then you will become thirsty, obviously, but there will be other things that occur that are going to try to keep you alive. But the main point here that you should know is that allostasis is an anticipatory behavior, while homeostasis is reactive in nature. So homeostasis happens, like the example of the bird pooping on itself because it's already getting hot, right? So allostasis, on the other hand, an example of that is drinking before you actually need any fluid, before you're actually deficient in blood volume, or before you have some kind of issue with ionic concentration. So we need to maintain our body temperature, and there's a couple of different types of organisms that do it with different strategies. So we're endotherms as humans. These are organisms that maintain their body at a metabolically favorable temperature, or, more colloquial, this is called warm-blooded animals or creatures. And then ectotherms are organisms that cannot maintain their body temperature and use external factors to do so. So like reptiles or cold-blooded animals. So we actually have a very strong kind of overpowered mechanic which allows us to increase our body temperature, which is very useful, especially since humans live in a variety of environmental contexts. If we couldn't maintain our body temperature, then obviously living in areas that are predominantly cold all the time would be out of the question. But we have the ability to conquer our environments because of this biological advantage. This biological advantage, though, is very calorically expensive. So calories in general are a measure of energy, and it's basically measuring how much energy it takes to heat water, a liter of water over 1 Celsius or something like that. But in general, it's a unit of measurement that's looking at how much energy it takes to do something in your body, right? So the average young adult expends over 2,600 kilocalories just to maintain their body weight on a daily basis, which is over 20 Twinkies. So eating this many Twinkies, all this energy is just going to maintaining your body temperature. And maintaining your temperature takes twice as much energy as all muscle activity, brain activity, and everything else that your body does combined. So this illustrates that our need to maintain temperature is extremely vital to our survival, as a lot, and in fact most of our energy consumption goes to maintaining body temperature, which is also kind of why people talk about the inability of exercise to actually produce a significant change in body weight over time. And this is largely true. A lot of what your body composition is going to be composed of as far as adipose tissue comes from what you're eating, because you're burning 2,600 calories just from maintaining your body temperature, right? Or kilocalories. And all the other basal metabolic processes that are happening in your body are burning way more calories than whatever it is that you're doing at the gym. I mean, if you go on the Stairmaster and get your heart rate up to 140 beats per minute for 30 minutes, I mean, like, maybe you're going to burn around 300 calories, which is, I don't know, like one of these, like 2 Twinkies or whatever. So basically, exercise is obviously important for a variety of things. Bone density, obviously, the more muscle you have, the less likely you are to have injuries in joints and things like that. But a lot of what your body composition is composed of, as far as like fat percentages and stuff like that, is realistically going to come from what you're eating and whether or not you're in a caloric surplus or a caloric deficit. Okay, so anyway, most of the heat we produce comes from metabolizing brown adipose tissue. And when this adipose tissue is metabolized, the energy is released as heat, which is different from muscle contraction. So a lot of our energy is coming from burning this brown adipose tissue rather than a muscle contraction, but we do have muscle activity to also generate heat. So obviously when we get cold and we're shivering, this increased muscle activity is going to generate heat as a byproduct of the actual muscle activity. And then we have contraction of various muscles while we're exercising. That's also going to generate heat. We can also, in a emergency scenario, kind of try to reduce heat a little bit by having all of our blood go towards the surface, to the skin, to try to release heat. But if we are in an emergency context where we are very cold and our vital organs are threatened, then that heat and that blood is going to go towards our internal organs. So if you're overheating, then your blood will go towards the surface to try to release some of that heat. If you are cold or freezing and your body starts to realize that your internal organs are going to start suffering, then the blood is redirected towards the internal organs to try to maintain heat on those systems. We only have one real mechanism to cool ourselves, though. So although we get some heat release by by redirecting the blood towards the skin or the surface, that is going to be largely in part due to our primary method of maintaining body temperature or reducing body temperature, which is sweating. So obviously, just like the vultures that are pooping on themselves and getting cooler from the evaporating moisture, we begin to sweat, which then, when that sweat evaporates, cools us down. So that is the main method that we have to cool ourselves down, which obviously you should know. You should also know that most of our calories are going to maintaining body temperature. You need to know the difference between allostasis and homeostasis. Just trying to, before we get too far in, give us some reminders of what we need to study for the exam. And obviously we have brain mechanisms that are mediating all of these effects: shivering, muscle contractions in response to cold, sweating, etc. So the physiological mechanisms that maintain body temperature depend on the interior hypothalamus and the preoptic area, or the preoptic nucleus. So you'll need to know that the hypothalamus is very important for temperature regulation. And specifically, you'll need to know that the anterior hypothalamus and the preoptic area project to the raphe nucleus, which is in the hindbrain, and this causes shivering, sweating, increase in heart rate, and an increase in metabolism. So this is essentially the main circuit that's going to regulate all of those behavioral responses that we were talking about. Fever is also an interesting phenomenon. When you have an infection, the immune system, which is all in our periphery, you have a central immune system also, but in this instance, it's talking about the peripheral immune system. And so when you have an infection, this immune system produces prostaglandins and histamines, which then communicate with the anterior hypothalamus and the preoptic area, which results in an increase in set point for body temperature. So as we pointed out, the set points are going to protect us and allow us to see when we've deviated from that set point to then tell the body what it needs to happen. So that set point is being set by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is saying, we need to stay at 90 degrees Celsius or whatever. I don't know, that'd be Fahrenheit. But that we need to stay at a certain temperature in order to maintain vital functioning. And the way that fevers are produced is that when we do have this infection and our immune system picks up on it, it releases prostaglandins and histamines that tells the hypothalamus to increase that set point, which is why then you start to produce a fever. So you need to know that fevers are produced through the communication of prostaglandins and histamines with the hypothalamus. And fevers make it harder for infections to survive, but they also tend to cause a lot of damage. So one thing that we should kind of observe in all of these biological mechanisms is that there's no free lunch in biology, which is also very important when it comes to pharmacology and manipulating our biology through exogenous mechanisms, right? So the fact that we are going to use something like a GLP-1 agonist to manipulate our body weight, like there's no free lunch in that. I mean, the way that it's working is by reducing our hunger and our association with rewarding aspects and food consumption. So that's going to have consequences, right? For some people, that's nausea because the receptor sites that are mediating this reduction in hunger are also in the area of the brain that is going to cause nausea. So, similarly here, increasing body temperature may kill some of the infections, but realistically, it's also, we have a certain set point for a reason. So just because we need to kill the invaders, that doesn't mean that our body is going to be able to survive very long at that increased temperature, which is why we then have febrile seizures and all sorts of things that are associated with increased temperature. Okay, so moving on to thirst. Thirst is a really interesting behavioral mechanism because it's one of the few drive states that are like almost impossible to ignore. I mean, next to breathing, when you are dehydrated and severely dehydrated, your desire to drink is going to override essentially any other motivational state that you have. It's more important than eating. Obviously, you'll die if you don't have enough calories, but your body can siphon calories from itself for quite a while before you're in dangerous territory. Whereas when it comes to thirst, and your ability to maintain fluid, I mean, you can't, like, once you're out of fluid, and your body is going to use that fluid relatively quickly. So it's not just about the actual water that's in your system. It's also about the ionic concentration. So thirst is so important because of how it mediates your ionic balance. So obviously, as we've gone over many times now with this action potential graph, my favorite one of all time, our body is, our cells in our body are dependent on potassium, sodium, calcium, chloride, and without a proper amount of these ions, then our neurons will not even be able to fire. So, and having too much is not good either. So for instance, if you remember from the action potential lecture, at the peak of the rising phase, we have the opening of these potassium channels. Now, one thing that we didn't go over just because it was a little bit out of the scope of this class is that in order for these receptors to reset, they have to reach a particular voltage. So just like how they open, they have to reach a particular voltage. They don't reset until the voltage has gone down to a certain level. So when it comes to like lethal injection, for instance, they're giving those people an injection of potassium, which increases extracellular potassium so much that the cell's charge or the membrane voltage can never get back to a resting state, which then makes it so the cardiomyocytes, which are your heart muscle cells, their voltage gated potassium channels can't reset, which means that they can't produce an action potential, which means that the heart can't pump. So having too much of a particular ion in your system is just as dangerous as having too little. And the amount of water or fluid in our system is going to heavily mediate that electrolytic balance. Also, obviously, without enough fluid, we won't have enough blood plasma to circulate our blood cells, which is not going to allow us to get oxygen to all of our various organ systems. So the body maintains a strict balance between, this is basically just summarizing what I just said, but how much water we have and how many electrolytes we have. If we have an electrolytic imbalance, we will die. If we don't have enough fluid in our body, we will not have enough blood to transport oxygen to our cells, and therefore we will die. Water consumption and electrolyte consumption are intrinsically linked. So you will develop an appetite for sodium when you are deprived of sodium. So salt, kind of gets a bad rap. A lot of people are saying not to consume too much salt because that increases blood pressure. This is a dubious claim at best. But what is true is that if you don't have enough salt, you will for sure die. And if you are deplete in salt, then you will have a very high motivational state to consume salt. So 60% of our body is composed of water, roughly. And of this, 33% of this water is found in extracellular fluid. So this is all of the fluid that is not cellular fluid. 66% of this fluid is intracellular fluid, right? So all of the water that's actually inside the cells doing various things. So it's inside of every kind of tissue: blood cells, bone cells, muscle cells, adipose cells, obviously nerve cells, everything. All of your cells are containing a significant amount of your body's water. So cellular dehydration is a very dangerous situation, but obviously we still need a lot of fluid for the extracellular space. So we have 25% of that extracellular fluid found in our interstitial fluid. So this includes fluid that's in between cells in the extracellular space, the lymph nodes or the lymph fluids, the GI fluids, spinal column fluid, fluid in eyes, tears, synovial fluid. So there's a lot of fluid that is just kind of floating around in between tissue, and obviously in our GI tract, that's very important. And then the rest of it, 8% or so, is in our blood plasma. So although this is the smallest percentage of where our water is in our body, obviously it doesn't make it any less important. If we don't have enough blood, then, as I just said, we're not going to be able to transport oxygen properly. So you should know, essentially, this slide here, how much of our body is, how much of where our fluid compartments are, that we have extracellular fluid, that we have intracellular fluid, and that we have two types of dehydrations. Okay, so let's first talk about intracellular dehydration and osmolality. So you have two types of dehydration. You have intracellular dehydration and you have extracellular dehydration. In order to understand this concept, though, we really need to talk about osmolality and osmotic pressure. So osmolality is a measurement of the solutes that are in your blood, or realistically, the solutes that are in any fluid. So solutes are substances that are dissolved in the solution, like sodium chloride, glucose, potassium, etc. You can have solutes that are dissolved in the fluid if they are soluble in that fluid, right? Meaning that they'll dissolve. And then you can measure the osmolality of that fluid. What happens, though, is that if you increase the amount of solutes in one particular space over another, and that space is permeable to water. So in this case, we're talking about cells, which the phospholipid bilayer is permeable to water. Then what's going to happen is if we increase the amount of solutes in the extracellular space, so here we have this little circle here, this is the cell, we have our phospholipid bilayer, we have water and sodium and chloride and potassium and all sorts of solutes that are in the cell and out of the cell. But if we increase the amount of sodium that's outside the cell, what's going to happen is that the water is going to be pulled out of the cell and it's going to be attracted to this high level of solute that's in the outside. And this is called osmotic pressure. So osmotic pressure is when water flows from areas of low solute concentration to areas of high solute concentration. So this is kind of similar to how ions move, and when we talked about this in the action potential lecture, when you have areas of high ionic concentration, like you have a bunch of sodium in the outside of the cell, the sodium is going to want to move inside the cell, right? This is kind of similar. If we have a high amount of solute outside the cell and we just increase that, by eating a bunch of bacon, a bunch of fries, a bunch of burger, whatever, anything that's giving us a high amount of solute in the extracellular space, which eating those foods are going to do, then that's going to pull the water out of the cell due to this osmotic pressure. Now, in the context of the cell, what's going to happen is that the cell is going to shrink. And this is essentially what intracellular dehydration is. So, intracellular dehydration, as the name is suggesting, is referring to the idea that water is being pulled out of the cell. So you're absolutely going to need to know that. And that's incredibly dangerous because a lot of the cell's functionality is obviously going to depend on water. So if your cells are dehydrated, then that's going to cause a major problem for physiological outcomes. Now, the problem is that the water just can't get back into the cell as long as we have this disruption in solute concentration. So, if we, however, maintain or, we pee out the excess solutes or, over time, we're going to use those solutes. Essentially what happens actually is that if you just have too many solutes, you'll just pee it out, assuming that you have the ability to pee and assuming that the solute concentration isn't at a dangerous level, like what happens with potassium, lethal injections of potassium chloride, like we went over very recently. But a consequence of intracellular dehydration is hypernatremia, which means when we have too much sodium, which is caused by losing water at a higher rate than losing sodium, can result in death due to electrolyte imbalance and loss of cellular function. So just like with the example of the lethal injection of potassium chloride, if we don't have a proper amount of sodium, then these voltage-gated sodium channels are not going to be able to reset, and we're going to have a disruption in the ability of the cell to fire. So that's very likely going to be a test question. Ionic concentration is important because if we don't have the proper amount, then our cells are not going to be able to recover, which is going to result in an inability to fire an action potential. And if we can't fire an action potential, then obviously the cell can't function, which means that whatever is depending on that cell to function is going to suffer. Now, luckily, in this scenario, if you do have hypernatremia, the solution is just consuming more fluid. So it's a pretty easy problem to fix, assuming that you're not in a scenario where you don't have access to fluid. Now, this is intracellular dehydration, and what causes intracellular dehydration is hypernatremia, but it's not true dehydration in the sense that your body may or may not actually be losing water. So just the scenario of increasing solutes and producing intracellular dehydration doesn't mean that your body is actually losing water. So that's an important distinction from the next kind of dehydration that we're going to talk about, which is actual dehydration, and that is extracellular dehydration. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk now about extracellular dehydration and hypovolemia. So extracellular dehydration and hypovolemia are not the same thing, but if you are hypovolemic, that means you will have extracellular dehydration. Extracellular dehydration is actual dehydration, which means that your body literally has lost fluid. So it's different from intracellular dehydration because, we can count the little water molecules here and we can see that they are the same in the intracellular dehydration event or in an event where we're not, where we don't have intracellular dehydration. When we have actual dehydration, though, that means that the body fluid, that we're actually losing total body water. So we have different compartments of water here. And if we're actually dehydrated or we have extracellular dehydration, then that's going to be problematic because that's likely indicating that we have hypovolemia. Now, hypovolemia is referring to a loss in both total body water and solutes because a hypovolemic insult is going to be driven by excessive bleeding, diarrhea, vomiting, also sweating. So sweating can cause hypovolemia. So that's why certain sports drinks like Powerade, Gatorade, Liquid IV, electrolyte mixes or whatever, they all have an increase in sodium, and that may make people a little bit confused. Like, well, why do you need sodium in this beverage? I thought sodium dehydrates you. Actually, that's not the case when you're hypovolemic. Because when you're hypovolemic and you're sweating, or if you have a scenario where you're vomiting, having diarrhea, or bleeding to death, you're losing an equal amount of water and solutes in that scenario, which means that you need to replenish both of them. And this can cause a really interesting problem because you can die even if you have enough total body water in a hypovolemic emergency. So let's say that you have some scenario where you're sweating a lot and you only have access to just water. If you continue to drink just water when you're having a severe case of the sweats, right? Like maybe you're in a scenario where someone's, I don't know, like I'm having trouble. I'm sure that anybody that's pre-med might be able to point out a more realistic example, but in the moment I can only think of a scenario where you're in the sauna and somebody's giving you a bottle of just water and not letting you out of the sauna. You're going to be in a lot of trouble because, obviously not just because you're overheating, but because you're excessively sweating and losing sodium and other solutes in that sweat and only replenishing the water. What's going to happen is that you're going to become hyponatremic. So in the case of our intracellular dehydration example, where we can have hypernatremia, which is going to pull the water out of the cells, you can also be hyponatremic, which means that your solute concentration is dangerously low, but your water concentration is high. So you can be hyponatremic due to not enough sodium, but you could also be hyponatremic from having too much water, which is why people can have water toxicity or drink too much water. It's not necessarily that the water itself is killing them, it's that the disruption of the ionic balance is going to kill them because they no longer have enough concentration of sodium or other solutes. So you'll need to know that hypovolemia is referring to an event where you're losing both water and solutes. This can happen from excessive bleeding. It can happen from diarrhea, vomiting, from sweating, and that's why when you're actually dehydrated from a hypovolemic insult, you need to replenish not just water but also solutes like sodium and potassium. Okay. Also, I just want to point out that actual dehydration or extracellular dehydration, this is saying that your total fluid volume is decreasing significantly, right? So if you have 60% of your total body water and you're actually becoming dehydrated because you have extracellular dehydration, that means that you're going to get caught into a feedback loop where you're eventually going to have intracellular dehydration as well. Because what's going to happen is that as you're losing body fluid from the extracellular space, your ionic concentration is going to be such that the water is going to want to move away from the intracellular space into the extracellular space, which means that if you continue to have this hypovolemic insult like diarrhea or vomiting or excessive bleeding, the extracellular space is going to keep siphoning water from the cells, which is going to then result in intracellular dehydration as well. So that's why this is actually dehydration, is because your total body water is actually being reduced. So for sure, you'll need to know what hypovolemia is. You'll need to know that what would happen in a scenario where you are excessively sweating, but you can only have access to water. So you'll need to know that you need to replenish those solutes as well. So the brain regulates thirst in a variety of ways. The first one is just by looking at blood volume. And that's in our peripheral nervous system, we have baroreceptors, which are found in the wall of the carotid artery of the neck and monitor changes in blood volume due to stretch of the blood vessels. So essentially, the baroreceptors are just going to make sure that you have a certain amount of blood pressure. If you have that blood pressure, you're all good. If you don't, then it will cause a baroreceptor reflex, which will ultimately cause a thirst outcome. We have the lamina terminalis, because by the way, just to make it clear, if you have a decrease in blood pressure, that's likely going to be due to a hypovolemic insult, right? So you could have a decrease in blood pressure due to heart failure. You know what I mean? If your heart is no longer pumping, then blood pressure is obviously going to go down. But you could also have a decrease in blood pressure because you're losing volume. So baroreceptors are going to be checking for volume and signaling to the brain if you are okay with total blood volume or not. And if you aren't, then it will cause thirst and sodium appetite. You also have the lamina terminalis, which is a group of neurons, or a group of nuclei within the brain. So the lamina terminalis is composed of the median preoptic nucleus, or the MNPO, the subfornical organ, the SFO, and the organum vasculosum of the lamina terminalis. This is the Latin, so laminae terminalis. But in any case, or the OVLT. It always reminds me of Ovaltine. But so you'll need to know for sure that baroreceptors are monitoring blood pressure. You'll need to know for sure that the lamina terminalis is composed of 3 subnuclei, including the median preoptic nucleus, the subfornical organ, and the organum vasculosum of the laminae terminalis. I'm for sure going to abbreviate that on the exam, so please memorize OVLT, as I don't want to type that out every time. Now, what's interesting about these thirst nuclei is that 2 of them, including the subfornical organ and the OVLT, are what's called circumventricular organs, meaning that they are surrounding the ventricles, and they do not have a blood-brain barrier. So if you remember, most of our brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier, which is composed of those astrocyte feet that are then pushing epithelial tissue together, which then allows us to, create a barrier where certain toxins and molecules can't get through to protect the brain. But the SFO and the OVLT are unprotected, and that's because they need to detect plasma osmolality. So they need to be able to determine how many solutes we have in our system, and if there is a decrease in that solute concentration, then the SFO and the OVLT will drive a sodium appetite. So you'll need to know for sure that this is the thirst center, the lamina terminalis, and the thirst center is composed of 3 nuclei. The MNPO, which is going to drive thirst specifically, the SFO, and the OVLT. And the SFO and the OVLT are also referred to as circumventricular organs because they surround the ventricles. and they are also not protected by the blood-brain barrier, and this is because they need to detect plasma osmolality. Okay, so we also have this peripheral control, which is the baroreceptors, but we also have other peripheral controls of thirst in the renin-angiotensin system. Okay, so when we have a drop in blood pressure and fluid volume, the kidneys can actually sense this and release something called renin. Renin then works on angiotensinogen, which is released from the liver, to produce angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 has some evidence that it has some receptors that is doing something, but primarily the role of angiotensin 1 is to be converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is released from the lungs. So I know that I'm spitting out a lot of stuff here, so let's just try to slow it down a little bit. Drop in blood volume and blood pressure results in the kidney sounding the alarm, saying, oh my God, we're having this hypovolemic insult. We need to release renin. Renin then acts on angiotensinogen, which has already been released by the liver, and produces angiotensin 1. The lungs then release angiotensin converting enzyme, which is, as the name suggests, going to convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 then goes on to constrict blood vessels, and that makes sense, right? Because if we are having a drop in blood pressure and fluid volume, that's indicative of a hypovolemic threat, right? A loss in total body water. And one way to increase that blood pressure is to constrict the vasculature. The other thing that angiotensin 2 does is it goes to the adrenal glands and releases aldosterone. Aldosterone then circles back to the kidney to stimulate reabsorption of salt and water. So what this is all happening, the reabsorption of salt and water is another protective effect here. So that we're not peeing out our solutes in our fluid, because obviously the kidney is going to ultimately decide whether or not we're going to filter the solutes and the water into our bladder and get rid of it. And once it's in the bladder, we can't get it back, basically. So, so this is a very important system where if you go further in biology or physiology, you will talk about this all the time. So you should learn this. But likely what I'm going to ask about on the exam is these two sections here, that if the kidney senses a drop in blood volume or pressure, we get the release of renin, which turns angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. ACE then converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which results in blood vessel constriction or vasoconstriction. This also has outcomes in the nervous system, which is that when we have low blood pressure, we get an increase in Ang2, right? And I told you that the SFO and the OVLT are sensing blood volume and blood solute concentration, but also it will essentially be sensitive to angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2 is detected by the SFO and the OVLT, and then the SFO and the OVLT then stimulate thirst through activating the MMPO. So if you have a hypovolemic insult, ultimately what's going to happen is the baroreceptors are going to start sounding the alarm. We're going to have the liver, or the kidney rather, start sounding the alarm. We're going to have constriction of blood vessels. We're going to have reabsorption of water and sodium in the kidney. We're going to tell the organism that they need to drink and consume salt. So this is like when you're having this kind of hypovolemic insult, essentially your nervous system is sounding the alarm because of what a negative effect being low on solutes and fluid is going to cause. So fluid homeostasis and thirst are vitally important to survival. I hope that was relatively straightforward. I know that it might have gotten a little bit jumbled here. But just know the parts that I highlighted there, and you should also know this cascade of events that Angiotensin 2 is going to be detected by the SFO and the OVLT, which is going to drive thirst and ultimately sodium appetite. And in our next lecture, we're going to, I believe, talk about feeding behaviors and caloric consumption. So I'll see you in the next lecture.